Hello, everyone, and welcome to Building SaaS on AWS, the AWS SaaS Factory show for builders of SaaS here on Twitch. My name is Anthony McClure, a solutions architect with the AWS SaaS Factory and your host for today's show. If you are a builder of software as a service solutions or are just a beginner beginning to learn how to build and create applications that can be deployed onto a multi-tenant SaaS environment, then this is the show for you. In every episode, we bring in experts that can dive deep into various elements and issues related to SaaS, and today is no exception. I'm happy to have with me here two additional AWS solutions architects in Shabankar Somar and Owen Hawkins. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
So why don't we start off with a quick introduction. Tell us a little bit about yourselves and what you do here at AWS. Owen, do you want to start?
Sure, no problem. Yeah, hi, I'm Owen Hawkins. I'm a senior solution architect working with enterprise software and SaaS customers in the UK. So in addition to my work inside the team, where we largely work with software companies who are based out of the UK, I'm also a member of our SaaS technical field community and our security and compliance technical field community, where we dive deep into those areas. So identity and SaaS are both very close to my heart. Shabankar.
Excellent. Welcome, Owen. And Shabankar.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you, Anthony. Hello, everyone. My name is Shabankar Somar. I'm a senior solution architect in AWS. I'm also part of SaaS technical field community, or the SaaS specialist team, you call it. I've been working with ISV customers who have been building SaaS solution on AWS platform over the last years. And prior to joining AWS, I was also tech advisor to the startups who are building SaaS solutions. So let's get going.
All right, excellent. Again, thank you both for being here. And to everyone joining us today on Twitch Live, welcome as well. As always, if you have any questions or comments for our guests, please feel free to put those into the comment section on Twitch, and we will try to answer those as we have time and as soon as we can. And while you're there, make sure and say hello to Bill Tarr, who is moderating for us again today. Welcome, Bill. So yeah, let's go ahead and jump right into things, shall we? So the title of today's episode is SaaS Identity and Onboarding with Amazon Cognito. And when I look at that title and I see SaaS identity, I notice that we're not just saying identity, right? And I think a lot of people, when they come across the term identity in relation to working or building out an application, they're thinking about authentication and authorization of an individual user. But when we're talking about SaaS identity, or we're adding that SaaS term to that, I assume that actually is a little bit different than normal identity may be. So can you give me an overview of what it means when we say SaaS identity and the critical role that it plays in modern software applications?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I think you very clearly articulated what is identity as such in a software platform, but when it comes to SaaS identity, it's very, very different. But before I go to SaaS identity, let me just quickly touch upon the tenant. What is tenant in a SaaS solution? So if you are building a SaaS, multi-tenant SaaS solution, a tenant is nothing but probably a business who is using your platform. So every business or every customer you have is a tenant, and every tenant can have hundreds of users within that time. So with that context, let's dive into SaaS identity, right? So what is the SaaS identity? Is basically the fundamental elements of SaaS platform. It is nothing but how you're connecting the user's identity, which Anthony talked about, with the tenant that user belongs to. And together, they are actually SaaS identity. And that information, that identity information, has to flow through your entire platform. So most of the platform today will be using some kind of authentication system, right? So in the world of SaaS, you need to extend the notion of identity to incorporate the tenancy to define SaaS identity. So when a user is authenticating, two things you need to know: who is that user and which tenant that user belongs to. And merging this together is actually SaaS identity. And in the world of SaaS, when you build a SaaS platform, I think that is very, very critical, because without knowing who the user and who the tenant the user belongs to, you won't be able to manage your platform. Because let's imagine you have especially around the operations team, you have a problem with one of the tenant. How do you know which tenant the platform that particular problem came, and within that particular issue, which user is having that issue? So that identity within the context of tenant, you need to make sure it's flowing through all the from top of your stack to the bottom of the stack, right? So that is super critical.
Interesting. So yeah, when you're dealing with a SaaS solution like we're talking about here, you have the SaaS provider, who the company or the entity that's providing the solution. Then you have the tenant, who is the purchaser, the main entity that is using that SaaS solution, and then you have the end users over here, right, that are actually working with or interacting with. But from what I'm hearing from you, it's vitally important that we understand not only who that end user is, but what tenant they're a part of. And I'm sure that plays into security and all sorts of other aspects as well.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
I think it's just worth adding there as well, though. We also need to think about the different use cases that our SaaS providers are building. So if you're building a business-to-business application as a SaaS, you have a very different model and the way that you authenticate to a business-to-consumer SaaS application. I might have a business-to-consumer SaaS application where I've got thousands of users, but they're happy to create a password. Whereas in an enterprise setting, those users have already got an enterprise username and password that they want to use even across their SaaS application. So it changes the scope of the problem, even with the size of the tenants as well.
Interesting. Yeah. And I assume that there's also challenges that can come up. Let's say if you are trying to manage these same user identities, maybe even across multiple SaaS applications, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, it can be very complicated to work that through. We often say that identity is hard, SaaS identity is really hard. And that's because of some of that complexity that, we just talked about. If you think about how difficult it is to manage user identity and authorization, if you then add on that tenant context as well, you've got three things that you're having to manage for. Not only am I managing the user and making sure they really are who they say they are, I've got to make sure they're part of the tenant they claim to be part of, and I've then got to work out what they're allowed to see inside that application. So it gives me quite a complicated problem. And when you overlay that B2B, B2C scenario that I just talked about as well, you can start adding in other people's IDPs to your SaaS solution. So at that point, if I've got an existing directory that I'm using for my enterprise users, I want to bring that to my SaaS provider, and I want them to federate to that identity so that I can then use that throughout my system. There's other things around that as well. If I've got multiple different applications inside my SaaS, or I'm a large enterprise using lots of SaaS, what I want to avoid is each of those individual SaaS applications requiring me to have a new username and password. We all know we're rubbish at usernames and passwords. People are just not good at them. Humans don't do passwords well. And that's why WebAuthn and things like that we should all be looking at anyway. But what we can do in the shorter term for that is we can also reduce that number of passwords. If we can federate in from those external environments, then we're reducing the number of times people have to authenticate. It also means the time to value on my SaaS is much faster because they're actually using their existing authentication credentials to access my services that I'm providing to them. But as the SaaS provider, the other thing I need to think about there is actually, how do I onboard and offboard these people as well? In the title, we talked about onboarding. It's not just creating the users. It's actually, how do I go about creating the users inside the construct of the tenant as a SaaS provider? Because that's quite a different problem to most identity problems managed through IDPs.
Now, you mentioned a couple of interesting things there that I think that we want to dive into a little bit deeper. And one of those was related to, tenant to tenant isolation from each other. And that sounds like we're getting into the realm of security. So when we're talking about this tenant isolation problem that can come up, we need to keep them separated, that they don't interact unless that's a core feature, of course, of the solution. Can you go into a little bit deeper of why that's important when we're talking about that in relation to SaaS identity architectures?
Well, sure. Yeah, I think that is very, very critical. Another fundamental puzzles within the whole block. The block within the whole puzzle, right? So like identity, SaaS identity, I think the partitioning, the isolation, tenant isolation is another topic, especially in the context of multi-tenant SaaS. If you're doing a SaaS solution which is siloed deployment, I think that's not a problem. But when you get into multi-tenant SaaS solution, then it is fundamental, because one of the reasons you do typically multi-tenant SaaS is because you want to share your infrastructure, and for the cost optimization, and of course of the operational efficiency, right? So, but at the same time, you also need to handle the challenges in terms of determining how to make sure that in a multi-tenant environment, each tenant is prevented from accessing each other's resources, especially business data. You cannot have a situation saying that tenant one is accessing tenant two data, business data especially, right? So how do you handle that? Because once you cross the boundary in any shape or form, which will actually expose a significant hole in your platform, and you're kind of out of business, right?
Right.
So you have to ensure that when you're doing a partitioning with a multi-tenant environment, it's super critical to do the architecture in the right way. But how do you do that? Because you have many factors which can influence that decision. How do you partition? For example, the domain you're working on, the compliance requirement within the domain, what kind of deployment model you have, and then on top of that, the selection of AWS services, right, that you all bring into as a part of the solution. All those things need to be considered. So, for example, if you're working in a fintech or let's say pharma industry, right, they might say, I don't want my data to be shared, or my database to be shared with any other tenant. So that means you are ending up with multiple database instances, for example, right? Or you might be in a scenario where saying, you know what, I know I'm in a multi-tenant environment. Customer might come back and say, oh, one of the tenant might, but I don't want my core services, which is the compute, basically the container which is being served, right, through which it is being served, should not be shared with another tenant. So that means you have it is impacting your deployment model. You are still a multi-tenant, but for every tenant, you are actually having a different container running, right? So
Right.
one side is deployment. Of course, that will impact your cost at the same time. So you need to make sure what use cases, what industry you're building your platform, and take care of those situations. And then accordingly, you go ahead and do your architecture and bring in all those partitioning at different layers. For example, like, should I use one S3 bucket for my multi-tenant platform, or should I use different bucket or different bucket prefixes within AWS per tenant, right? So again, everything is driven by your use cases, but please do understand or make sure you nail down all these use cases when you finalizing your architecture.
And like a lot of things in SaaS, right? When these questions are asked, how should we go about doing, say, an isolation in this case? The answer many times is, well, it depends, right? It depends on the use case. It depends on the architecture. It depends on the compute that you're using, the databases. So that there's many different ways that we can go about enforcing or at least setting up isolation, I should say. And it's really dependent based on the use case. We actually have a question somewhat related to this. That is, what is the best way to do tenant isolation in containerized environments? And they mentioned namespaces, role-based access control. And, my first answer to this again is, well, it depends, right? Because both are absolutely valid solutions. And I think we see generally in most of the customers that I've interacted with personally, that namespaces tends to be the more popular way of going about doing isolation, specifically when we're talking about containers. But have you seen anything different?
I think that's definitely the typical model that I see with customers as well, is running in separate namespaces is the most common method of deployment. Yeah. One of the other mechanisms I do see a lot, though, is actually running individual Fargate containers on behalf of individual tenants. So where you are moving towards that serverless model, you can get away with having resources that are spun up specifically for an individual tenant. Because
much more of a silo-like environment in that case.
Exactly, but ephemeral silo, right? So a silo that doesn't last for very long, it's only there while the customer's using it.
Yeah.
And so long as you're passing your application identity in a consistent way across your platform, you should be able to manage that in a number of different ways, right? And that's where RBAC comes in as well. If I'm passing my roles as part of my identity management, then again, I can pass that into whatever the containers are that I'm using.
Yeah, great question. And of course, we could probably go on for another hour or many more just talking about isolation, tenant isolation platforms. And Bill, maybe you could put in some resources there or link to some articles that we've written that are specific about this into chat. I would appreciate that. Thank you very much for the question. So back specifically here to tenant isolation and what we were just talking about, Shabankar. We talked about the isolation itself and kind of why it's important and how it is a function of the authentication platform of a SaaS identity, really. But how do we actually go about enforcing that? All right. Once we have that tenant context in relation to the user identity and that overall SaaS identity established, how does that then get applied to this tenant context?
Yeah, so I'll take that one if that's okay, Anthony, because
Sure.
I think the way that we talk about doing this typically is to make sure that we're passing that tenant context around between our application components. So what we need is all areas of our application to understand that user identity and the tenant context combined together to give us that SaaS identity, as we call it. And that SaaS identity needs to be available to every application. And there's a number of different reasons for that. And Shabanka covered a lot of them in an earlier question. But, I need to be able to pass that identity through to my billing and my metrics and make sure it's in my logs and all those other things. So the easy way to make that available across all those applications is include it as a JSON web token, a JWT, along with the request we're making to those individual applications. So as I call my microservice, I pass the SaaS identity containing JOT to the service that's being called. And what that allows me to do, and sorry, I've just got a quick thing around JOTs. JSON web token called JOT. If anybody knows why, please tell me in the comments. It's in the RFC. It says JSON web tokens, call them JOTs. I have no idea why. I've never been able to get a good answer. So if somebody can educate me, I'd be really grateful.
It is what it is.
Exactly, yeah. So we pass that JOT along to our individual applications. And at that point, we can validate the content of that JOT, verify that it was created by us, and it's a valid JOT and it's still in time. And what we can then do is we can use that to provide that context in a latency-free manner. Where lots of people start out when they're looking at SaaS is they say, well, it's easy. I just pass in a user identity. I don't need to know what tenant it is because I can look up from the JOT token that's been passed in which tenant Shabanka belongs to. And there's a few different issues with that. Shabanka as a person is not the same as Shabanka as a SaaS identity. Because if he happens to be a customer of two different tenants, the example I normally use here is if your SaaS is an accounting piece of software, if Anthony's doing my accountancy at the end of the year and Shabanka's at the end of the year to work out how much tax we owe, he might have to log in two different tenant contexts as the same person. So his user identity and his tenant context are separate. Now, if you think about a large complex system where you've got lots of microservices, if each of those microservices had to go back to a central service to say, which tenant does Shabanka belong to, not only might it be very difficult to map that through because of the scenario just talked about where you might belong to multiple tenants, but in addition to that, it's another call that every service has to make before they write a log, before they record a metric. So it's just building in that bottleneck. If we can pass that with the request, each individual application can then consume that JOT token, not only validate it, which is good security, but then in addition to that, get the tenant credentials from that JOT token, the tenant context from that JOT token, so you can see which tenant they belong to. We can then enforce isolation inside that application based off the tenant context that's been passed in.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, and I think all of that makes a lot of sense conceptually, but ultimately, it sounds very complex, right? As far as the actual creation and working with this. So in thinking about trying to solution this out and how we would actually build this into our application, maybe this is where Cognito comes in in this concept of an identity provider. So what are the benefits really of using a service like AWS Cognito for SaaS identity compared to, say, going out and just building everything kind of yourself?
Yeah.
So let me take that. Yeah. So the good question, right? Why should I use a service like Cognito or Auth0 or Okta as opposed to why shouldn't I build it? So I think it goes back to the traditional question of build versus use and products, right?
Yeah.
So do you want to use next 6 months or 12 months to build an authentication framework, which is proprietary only for your application, which you may not be able to monetize, for example, right? And then you keep on managing that, which is not a industry standard compliant. So industry is moving forward every other day. There are new compliance are coming, new method of authentication is coming in. You have to have a team. I have to have a team and energy and money and time to put in to build that, right? So rather, I would go and use Cognito or anything which suits your technology stack and leverage that. So if you already have something, let's say Okta or any other third-party IDP, you can still use Cognito and federate with those IDP and continue to use the rest of the application, right? I think the message is think before you build your own, right? We have seen our customers who are from a legacy point of view, they build it, but they understand the pain of managing those and eventually moving into one of those industry standard IDPs. Of course, that gives a lot of flexibility in terms of how they want to use it within the platform.
And if I may just add on there as well. I mean, the other thing is let's be brutal about it. People are generally not very good at writing identity management tools. It's really hard. And if you go away and you write your own, you write one solution that does authentication, identity management. If you are Cognito or Okta or Auth0, whoever else, these services that do this, actually you've done that, you've deployed it. It's what you do for a living. So your chances are that you're going to do it better because it's not a one-off that somebody's trying to work out how to do for the first time, right?
Yeah, I think most organizations that are interested in producing a product for sale to others are more interested in focusing on their intellectual property, right? The product that they actually want to bring to market and not having to deal with what is essentially an entirely different product in the case of something like identity providing that these services like Cognito do provide for us out of the box. So it's a question of where do you want to spend your time, right? And there's always opportunity costs that are involved in anything that we do in software development, and this of course is a big one. So I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, that being said, I've heard us mention this term federation a couple of times, and thinking about single sign-on and how do we ultimately handle that, right? Or how can we make it so that our customers or your SaaS tenants ultimately can use even their own internal authentication, but still work with your SaaS. So specifically to Cognito now, how does AWS Cognito address the need, for these single sign-on situations and ultimately integrate with external identity providers?
Yeah, so one of the features that's available inside the Cognito user pools is the ability to federate in external identity directories. So you can use a SAML integration or an OIDC integration from an existing directory. And we use that in a number of different ways. In the B2C world, we tend to use it to enable things like Google authentication or Facebook authentication into
social
one of
media.
The social providers giving us authentication in so that somebody, again, as I talked about earlier on, doesn't have to remember a username and password, even in their B2C world. And what do we do inside Cognito user pools with that is we define who are those federated providers that we're going to trust. We give some metadata into the user pool to determine what that trust is. And essentially that's swapping some secrets. Yeah, I won't go into detail, but let's just call it swapping some secrets so that we can check it's the right endpoint. Then what we say is we trust that that external provider is going to authenticate the user correctly. Whatever that setting is for that external provider, we trust that inside Cognito. We then check the secret to validate that it's really come from the right place. And then we authenticate them in Cognito. So The important part behind it, though, is that it gives us a consistent mechanism to authenticate everybody. If I've logged in with Google, or if I've logged in with my own enterprise directory that's integrated via SAML, what I get back is still a Cognito JWT token, regardless of which of the federated providers I've used, or whether I've logged in against Cognito and it's remembered my username and password directly. I still get back a Cognito token. And that's really important. So when I've got lots of federated identities being passed in, it means as the SaaS provider, I've got one type of JOT token I have to integrate into my application. I've got one thing that I trust. Yeah. So I think that's the big important thing. So Cognito for SaaS providers is a really good fit in that model, because not only does it give me a consistent mechanism to pull back those tokens, but it means actually I'm not managing passwords on behalf of people. I haven't got to help them reset their password if they get stuck. That's their existing identity provider. And in the enterprise world, there's already processes set up for that. So in your B2B SaaS model, everybody will have those internal help desk calls already set up to reset your AD password if it's that. So the SaaS provider can benefit from that in that they don't have to do any of those operational processes that otherwise they'd have to provide if people are typing in a username and password directly.
So in that case, it sounds like Cognito really kind of gives us a little bit of a best of all worlds, right? You can manage users directly with Cognito. So you can have users that are authenticating directly to Cognito, but you then have that option of integrating and federating out to other services as well. And at the end of the day, again, you as the provider of your SaaS solution don't have to worry about how are we storing passwords, what are the requirements of those passwords. You can kind of set that and forget it. Or in the case of federated users, that's handled by their own enterprise. You don't have to be involved in those conversations. It's just, hey, is this user authenticated with you? Are they authorized to come into your SaaS solution? And you only have one point of contact, one point of code to actually ultimately integrate into your own solutions. It's a really good and powerful option that we have available. And beyond that as well, so we're talking about working within the AWS cloud here, building out services and solutions on AWS. I assume that Cognito also has integrations with other commonly used services in AWS?
Yeah. So yes. So once you have authenticated yourself, for example, right, in this case, whether with Cognito or with third-party IDP providers, right? So you have the JOT, or mentioning, right? At the end of the day, you have a JOT, which is provided by Cognito. So once you have that, there's something called identity pool within Cognito. We'll talk about that a little bit in details in the architecture discussion, right? So you effectively use the identity pool to get a temporary credential, we call it STS, which will let you access some of the AWS services which your front-end application code might require. So for example, you might want to upload a file to S3 bucket, right? So what you do, you exchange that JOT token to get an STS credentials, which is a temporary token, short-lived. You can define how long it's valid, and then use that token to access the individual AWS services. It could be S3, it could be DynamoDB, or some other services, right? So we'll get into a little more details as part of subsequent sessions.
Excellent. Very, very good. In fact, I think it's probably a good time for us to maybe change topic here a little bit and start talking about architecture next. Before we do so, though, anyone that has joined us late, this is, or you are watching currently, Building SaaS on AWS. I'm joined here today with Shavankar Samar and Owen Hawkins, both solutions architects with AWS themselves, and we are discussing SaaS identity and onboarding with Amazon Cognito. So, Shavankar, I'll go ahead and bring up your architecture slides here.
Yes. So let's cover a couple of fundamental concept of Cognito and architecture, how the whole authorization happens before we go to a quick demo. So fundamentally, Cognito has got two services. One is user pool and other is identity pool. And of course, you use You don't need to use both based on the use cases you pick and choose. Now, so Cognito user pool is for unauthenticated users to be authenticated. Either you do natively or through a federation, as Wayne mentioned, with a third-party identity provider. So user pool effectively a directory where you can store users, offer them sign up, sign in. You can manage their profile, password, etc. Right? This is usually a service you use when you have the requirement kind, like I want to authenticate users into my web or mobile application, right? So in the user pool, you start with an unauthenticated user. You go through the sign up, sign in, and you end up with a JWT token returned to your application after successful sign in, right? So that is what the user pool does. At the end, after successful authentication, you get a JWT token. Now, once you have that token, then your identity pool is coming into picture. So the identity pool actually uses that token and gives you a temporary AWS credentials, which you use to connect to S3, DynamoDB, or other AWS services, provided you have the right kind of credentials already given. So with that thing, let's dive into a little more into the architecture. So what you typically have, you have a client application, and then you have Cognito, and then you use Cognito to authenticate. And then, of course, once you are authenticated, you pass that JOT token to go and authorize yourself, push that, and then call the different backend services, right? And then, so what actually happens? Let's go through the flow. So you enter your user ID password, or you sign up for the first time, providing your user ID password. Once you provide that, or of course, optionally, you can connect, it can redirect to a third-party identity provider, which, as Wayne was mentioning, like you get a token from there, we trust that, we validate that within the Cognito user pool, and then what you get is Cognito token. So just see here, everything is actually, as when pointed out, is managed through the Cognito. You have only at the end, irrespective of which IDP you are using, whether it's a Cognito or any other third party, you actually getting at the end of the day Cognito JOT, which is Cognito token at the end of number 4, right?
Quick question for you, Shavankar, as well. So when this first authentication process comes up here, for the end user, whether they're signing up for the first time or they're authenticating, that user interface is being provided by Cognito as well. Is that right?
Yes. So there are multiple ways you can get the user interface. Of course, Cognito provides hosted, we call it hosted UI. You can customize the bit to your requirement. However, you can use the SDKs to have your own user interface based on your requirements. So you have multiple options. It's up to you how you want to do that, right?
I think, again, that's one of the big benefits of that external federated provider access as well, in that actually in those cases, I don't even need to provide a sign-up UI. Effectively, what I'm doing at that point is bouncing them straight through Cognito onto that external identity provider. So, that's another big win for that use case, right?
Exactly. Great. So once you have the tokens, what you do, you actually use the token for authorization. And as of course, for every tenant, every user, we will have a set of capability or set of action they can perform. So you can do those authorization before you call the backend services through API Gateway or load balance or AWS AppSync. Now, so that is one flow. That is the flow you follow. Now, what happens if you want to use some of the AWS backend services, AWS services, right, from the front-end application? As I was referring earlier, let's say I want to upload some file to S3 bucket. So
S3.
S3 in the S3 bucket, yes. So what you do, you pass on the same temporary credentials to user identity pool, and you get back a you pass on the JWT token and you get back a temporary credential and use the credential to access your other AWS services, in this case S3 bucket, and upload the file in S3 bucket.
And
Right.
there's just something I'd like to add there, if that's okay, Shubhankar, is also
Sure.
we need to think about the contents of that token. It's one of the things we're going to go through when we look at the demo. But we talked earlier on about adding that tenant context into the tokens in addition to the user context. That's what we're controlling inside that Cognito user pool here. So we are creating the tenant context in Cognito. Regardless of whether I've taken an authentication from a federated external identity provider or whether I've authenticated directly, I, as the SaaS provider, own the control of that tenant context. So when I pass that token back from Cognito, it's got that tenant context embedded within it. So when I use it for my microservices, I can see that. But also when I pass it to an identity pool, I can actually map that out from the identity pool. So I can say, in my identity pool, if you've got this tenant ID, assign this role in IAM when you give back that temporary access. So I can tie that S3 bucket that we're talking about to a tenant level, or I can even do it at a user level if I need to as well.
Exactly.
And then once that information is, either in the JOT or ultimately going to the identity pool, later on, like your microservices, for instance, all they have to understand at that point is how to crack open the JOT and get that information that it needs, right? Versus having to do that bottleneck that you were talking about earlier of say, going back to a database or whatever user store that you have, and that has that relationship between the user and the tenants to figure out who's who and what's what. So it helps to eliminate that bottleneck.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. So now we have understood at very high level how the whole flow works. Let's get to the demo. And
excellent. We like demos.
How it works. How it works inside, right? So handing over to Wayne for the demo.
Sure. So I've just been talking about what we embed into those tokens. So for the UK viewers in front of us, here's something I prepared earlier, is from a famous TV show in the UK. But I've got a Cognito pool already set up here. And you can see that I've got my application client and my user pool set up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to authenticate against this. And everybody loves a catchy username. And I'm going to hit this authenticate here. Now, what this will do for me is this has gone away and it's used the AWS SDK to call Cognito user pool directly and perform the authentication. That's why it gave me that initiate auth API. And a bit later on, we'll talk about the different ways you can integrate Cognito into your client applications, but that's one of the mechanisms by which you can do it. So what that's done for me now is that's given me back some tokens. And you can see I've got an ID token and an access token. So just a brief word on the difference between an ID token and an access token. So an access token, you should think of very much like a key to your front door. It's something to prove that you should be allowed to come in. The ID token is more like your driver's license or your passport. It contains information about you. So in Cognito, when we're talking about adding custom claims into tokens, we mean the identity token in this case. And it's a place that sometimes people get a bit confused about, because the RFCs say, don't pass identity tokens to APIs. Now, what that means, and it's a very gray area in the RFC, but what it really means in our interpretation as AWS is don't pass your identity tokens to third-party APIs. If you're going to sign up to Stripe as a billing service provider, you don't prove your identity by passing an identity token that you've generated yourself. You pass an access token that proves who you are. So in our context, we're going to use this identity token here. So hopefully you can see inside this identity token, and you can see all sorts of things about, this is the issuer. So this is the user pool, the Cognito user pool that issued that token, but currently it's unverified. You can see when it expires. And when we're talking about the applications, like, to use Anthony's words, cracking open that JWT token to see what's inside, this is what we're talking about them doing. So we'll verify that token. So what that's doing is that's checking that it was signed by this issuer, by this user pool. So because there's an asymmetric key pair with that user pool, the user pool signs it with its private key. We can see the public key because it's on a public endpoint, and we can validate that that's been signed by the right thing. So we can say it's from our user pool cryptographically. We also check the expiration date because obviously we never want to be using tokens that have expired. And we've got some AWS libraries, one written by my good friend Otto Cruz, called JRoomT Verify, that I'm sure Bill will share the link to, which is our standardized way of doing this. And one of the great things about that library is that it doesn't use any external dependencies. So it's entirely atomic. So when you're worrying about your software bill of materials, it means you've got a very short supply chain to worry about in that instance. But inside this ID token, let's have a look what's in here. And for those of you who know about JWT tokens, they're made up of effectively a header, and this says which key it is that signed it and what the algorithm was, and the payload. But the payload is in a slightly easier to read format here, so we'll stick with this. So what we've got here is we've got the claim set. So this subject ID is who I am as a user, but the important part for us is our tenant identifier. So you can see what I've got here is I've got a custom claim, and that custom is prepended by Cognito. So in Cognito, when we create a custom claim, it always gets custom at the start of it. And in this instance, it's a custom tenant ID with this value here. So you can see that I'm passing that tenant ID inside my token to every service that then consumes it. Now, what I've also got in here as well is I've got this custom user role. So I'm not only determining which tenant I belong to, I'm determining which role I have inside that tenant. So if I was a read-only user or standard user, I don't have that tenant admin claim in this user role. But it means what I can then do is when I'm authorizing on that token, so as Shabanka showed us in that diagram, when I pass it through to an API gateway, for example, I can break open the token, look not only that it's the right tenant for what we're trying to access, but also that the user has the role to be able to access it as well. So we'll talk about authorization as well a little bit later on. The other thing inside this claim is that I also have a Cognito group. So this actually is also the tenant identifier. So there's two different ways you can think of that you can add in that tenant identifier to a claim. One is you can add it as a custom attribute, which is this one here, or you can add it as a group, and you give that group name the name of the tenant identifier. And one of the reasons you might choose to do that is actually that group identifier. I said that we don't change the claims inside an access token, but a group claim is actually put in both tokens, access and identity. So in that case, you can pass that between both. So let's look at something that's a bit more like a real application. As you can see, we've spent a long time working on the UI UX for this one. And let's log in here. Let's see if the demo gods will be kind to me. Okay, let's just sign out. I must have logged in already. Who'd have thought? Just make sure we're logged in as the right user. I'm sure demos are much more performant before you start your screen share, right? So let's go through this login journey here. So here you can see I've got my catchy username again, and I'll type in.
And that UI is coming from. Is that coming from the application, or is that coming from Cognito at that point?
Yeah. So in this particular case, this is the application providing this UI. So there is a hosted UI as well, but in this case, we're using the application to provide the UI. I'll hit the sign in button, and fingers crossed, we'll see the same screen you saw 2 seconds ago. There we go. So where this takes us into now is a little dashboard, which is entirely faked up. But let's have a look at this debug tool up here. And you can see I've got my ID token and my access token. And in this particular case, you can see I'm still a tenant admin. And for those of you who managed to write it down really quickly, I've got the same tenant ID I had before. It's probably easier to look at the email address where I've put tenant1 in the email address. So this is logged in as tenant1 at the moment. And you can see what I've done in my application then is I've used that token in the application calls that I'm making to segregate the data from the tenants. So in this particular case, tenant1 has a secret product that's $50. And they've got an order for some secret product. I think it was 5 secret products that somebody ordered. Okay.
So this goes back to our discussion earlier about how we take SaaS identity and combine that with tenant isolation to separate data, right?
Absolutely.
Exactly. And there's a number of different ways you can do this. What I've got here in this example is that being enforced only at the application level, but I could actually change that in the way that Shubhankar was talking about to enforce that at the IAM level as well. So when I call the DynamoDB table that's behind this, I could actually swap my token for my JOT token for an STS credential that I then use to call that DynamoDB table. And that gives me strong isolation that ties together my application identity and the underlying IAM identity. And Bill, who's moderating away in the background, will be able to share his excellent blog post on the subject where he talks about that. So that will be an excellent thing for him to do. So I'm going to sign out as this user now. We've had a little look at this user, and I'm now going to sign in as my second tenant. And we'll go in, and we're going to have a look at what we've actually got in the Cognito backend in just a second. But let's just prove I do actually have some tenant separation first. And here we can see we've got tenant 2 and a different tenant identity that's inside our token. And fingers crossed, we'll see some different products.
Yeah.
Okay, and tenant 2's got some cool products and some not so cool products, but unfortunately they haven't managed to sell any of them. So they've got no orders. But you can see at the application level, we're actually filtering on that tenant identifier that we've taken out of the JWT. And in the database at the back end that we'll look at in just a second, we'll see it's actually exactly the same table. It's just indexed on tenant ID, and we're separating the information out based off that tenant ID. So let's have a little look now at what that looks like in Cognito. Oh, come on. And here we can see, in this case, I've got a shared user pool for my tenants. So it's probably one of the key things that people always bring up when they first start looking at Cognito and multi-tenant environments is, should I have one Cognito user pool and share it across my tenants, or should I have lots of Cognito user pools? And
it's funny that you mentioned that, Owen, because we actually got a question exactly about that thing. Yes, Jaquan actually
question pre-written.
Jaquan actually was asking that specifically, that they they're just starting out, they have a smaller number of tenants, and they're asking, does it make sense for them to stick with a single user pool as they have been, or maybe think about switching that out?
Yeah, so the logic that I normally use behind that to start thinking about when I separate out my tenants is sort of three things. One is, if there's a concern about data residency, your user pools have to be geographically dispersed. So if particularly somewhere like Australia, for example, where they have very strict data residency rules, you almost certainly have to have a user pool in Australia. So if you've got geographically diverse users, they will have different legal requirements that might mean you have to. The next thing I think about is, do they have very different requirements for their Cognito user pool? So if I have a user pool where everybody can have the same password policy, or everybody can have MFA or not have MFA, some of these things are configured in Cognito user pools at the pool level. So if you've got any differences at the pool level, then that would be one of the other reasons that I'd separate out. The last one is when I'm thinking about separation of risk profiles. So I will very often have a shared user pool for everybody who is having their username and password controlled by the SaaS provider. Okay, so if you're the SaaS application and you've got people's usernames and passwords that you're managing on their behalf, absolutely share the user pool, put in a custom claim, put in a custom group, whatever it may be, but share the user pool. But if you then have some customers who are using Federation, manage them in a separate user pool. That's the other separation of risk that I'd normally go about. And maybe that's just the old security person inside me, but it's a different threat profile across those two different things. So that's one of the other reasons I would normally be triggered to separate them out. Technically, there is no need to do it even then. So yeah, you could absolutely still have them share a user pool. It's about separation of risk, and it's about those other things that I covered, which you can't change at an individual user pool level.
Yeah, just to add one point, quick point there. Of course, when you so question around whether you need to use one or many. So if you decide to go with one tenant, one user pool, please do look at the quota or Cognito user pool per region per account, right? So if you have tens of thousands of tenant, you probably avoid using per tenant user pool because you will probably hit the limit, right? So then you can possibly use the user pool and app client combination, which will give you much more capacity in terms of what you can do. But do have a look at consider around the quota limit for each of those.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Shabanka. It's also important to remember it's not a one-way door, right? You don't have to make this decision and never be able to change it as well. If you look at something like our SaaS reference architecture, serverless SaaS reference architecture, what we have inside that is we have different user pools on a per tier basis inside your application. So it could be if you've got a standard or a basic tier of customer that's paying so much, they get a shared user pool. And absolutely that can be how you start off. But then as you grow, if you have a customer that turns around and says, I want my own, then you can still have that added on, but you add it on as a platinum tier of experience. Because it is more complicated to manage multiple user pools, but it's perfectly doable. And the serverless SaaS reference architecture has an excellent example about how you can manage that on different tiers. So at a platinum tier, you get your own user pool, and there's a code pipeline that deploys that for you. And then in a standard tier, which is exactly the example I'm using here today, we just get a shared user pool where they're created inside the same user pool. Okay, so going back to our claims that we had inside our token, you can see here, this is my user. And inside this user, you can see these are these custom attributes that have been created for the user role and the tenant ID for this individual user. Now, it's important to know here the way that this user has been created, because what I've done when I created this user is I didn't just go to Cognito and sign up for it directly. Via my application, I actually intercepted the creation of that user and called a user registration service. And what that user registration service has done is it allows me to capture the information that I need to about that user. And then I've added on an overlay of the tenant. So in this case, any minute now. So obviously a long way to Oregon today. So in this particular case, I've got a DynamoDB table that I'm using where I take the data in from that user registration process. That user is registered inside there. And then it means I can orchestrate the onboarding of that user into Cognito. So I create the user identity at that point in Cognito with the attributes set from this tenant detail table here. So you can see I've got a tenant detail table. In fact, in a minute, you'll be able to see I've got a tenant detail table. And what I've got inside that tenant detail table is that I've got, and the tenant user mapping, are the users mapped against the individual tenants. So I've created the tenant as an entity, and then I've also created the users and mapped them to that tenant. So by holding that externally, it means I've got that mapping externally in my DynamoDB tables, and then I'm using Cognito as a consumer of that information.
Owen, I'm sorry to say that we're actually coming up on time here to cut you off, but I know that we also wanted to really quickly also talk about, we've been looking at single user pool here. Yep. What about in a situation where we do want to have multiple user pools?
So the difficult thing to work out when we've got multiple user pools is we have to think about how we're going to get the user to the right pool. And this is a generic thing, not a Cognito thing, but if I'm part of tenant A, I need to make sure that I'm going to the right user pool for tenant A. Now, there's a number of different ways I can do that. The simplest coarse grain way is that I have a specific URL or URI for that specific tenant to go to, and that's where that tenant logs onto your SaaS app. And at that point, I know if they've hit that endpoint, they're logging on using that particular user pool. The slightly more nuanced version of that is I can actually have a service where I query that. So what I can have is I type in my username, I query from that what are the details that I need to get to the right user pool, and then my application client dynamically adjusts the config setting inside it to update that user pool information. So for example, in Amplify, you just dynamically pass that string in back from the response that's passed. It sends you to the right user pool, and then you can authenticate. Yeah. And that also applies across having different application clients rather than user pools as well.
And fascinating stuff. And I know we could probably go on for hours and hours talking about this topic.
I often do, I'm afraid, yeah.
And of course, for anybody that is joining us or interested in learning more about these topics, please feel free to reach out to myself, to Bill, to Shabankar and Owen. We here at AWS would be happy to work with you and in order to help you in your process of looking at authentication and authorization and building out SaaS identity or any other SaaS topics that you have. Of course, though, our time here today begins to come to an end, and I want to just say great big thank you to Shabankar and Owen for being here with us today. Fantastic information. I really appreciate it. And of course, to everyone that is joining us here on Twitch Live today, thank you for being here as well. And to our awesome moderator, Bill Tarr. To everyone out there, goodbye for today, and we'll see you next time when we bring you another episode of Building SaaS on AWS. Until then, happy building, everybody.